morning. It's Sunday, May the 8th. I'd like to take this opportunity to wish a happy Mother's Day to all of you who are moms or who are spending time with your moms today. I hope you have a wonderful day. I hope the weather is great wherever you are. It's nice to see that with the easing of some restrictions, we're able to gather together with our family and friends in ways that we probably didn't a year or two ago. So I hope you're enjoying a great day and a day that's full of happiness and appreciation. Back in the fall of 2019, I preached a series of messages that was based on passages from the Bible that people gave me. We probably all have our favorite passages, stories, verses in the Bible, and we may not always hear preachers preach on them, so I thought it might be an interesting idea to have people suggest their favorite stories or passages from the Bible to me, then I would write a sermon based on those passages and even share a little bit about why that particular story or Bible reading was meaningful to individuals. One of the passages that was given to me was Psalm 61, which I'll read with you in a few minutes. And as I thought about that psalm, I thought that it would be a good psalm, a good reading for New Year's Day. So on January 1, 2020, I chose this psalm that was submitted to me by a friend in my church. And as I read the psalm, I think you'll understand why it's fitting for reflection, for reading on New Year's Day, because it's a psalm that gives confidence and hope and security to us. It's not only something we need to hear and experience on New Year's Day, but perhaps especially then. And as we've been reflecting on Amazing Grace for some weeks, you'll recall that the words for that great hymn were written by John Newton for a service on New Year's Day. A song with verses that spoke of faith and its review, how God has always been faithful in the past, and expectation, how God will always be gracious to us with his amazing grace in the future. So let's hear these words of Psalm 61, and I think you'll find that as I share reflections with you on them, you'll find them very appropriate even on this Mother's Day. Psalm 61, like so many psalms, is a psalm of David, and it reads as follows. Hear my cry, O God. Listen to my prayer. From the ends of the earth I call to you. I call as my heart grows faint. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I, for you have been my refuge, a strong tower against the foe. I long to dwell in your tent forever and take refuge in the shadow of your wings. For you have heard my vows, O God. You have given me the heritage of those who fear your name. Increase the days of the king's life, his years for many generations. May he be enthroned in God's presence forever. Appoint your love and faithfulness to protect him. Then will I ever sing praise to your name and fulfill my vows day after day. Again, you can understand and appreciate why this is a fitting psalm for New Year's Day, and especially for times in our lives when we feel vulnerable, afraid, somewhat uncertain about what the future may have in store for us. The one image in that psalm that made this passage so loved and a favorite passage from the Bible for the person who sent this and submitted this passage to me is that verse and that image that talks about God being our rock. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. Now, there's a couple of interesting things about that image. The first thing is that David is acknowledging that he is a rock. And I think that we can safely make that claim about ourselves, that we are rocks. We have strength, we have capacity, we have security. But David knows, in spite of his own strength and stability, that he needs a higher rock. Lead me to the rock that is higher than the rock that I am, is another way of thinking about that verse in Psalm 61. So we, on the one hand, can know that we have security, stability, but we also know, as David did, that we have limitations. we are not at all the kind of refuge and fortress and source of strength that God alone can provide, which is why David and why we also many times cry out to him to be our fortress, to protect us, to guide us, to be that rock that is far greater and higher than we are. How many times do we not look at ourselves and think that we have it all together? We've accomplished a lot. The future is pretty well secure. We've saved money. We've earned a lot of good things. We feel sometimes as if we are resilient against whatever may come our way. But then there are times when we realize that that's just not the case. Life hits us hard sometimes, as it did for David when he wrote this psalm. We feel like we've come to the end of our rope. The end of the earth is the image that David uses in this psalm as he is on the run. He's at the end of his life, presumably. And as we experience the end of hope, the end of our own sense of stability, we also cry out to God as he did, asking that he will lead us to his own strength, to that rock that he is, that is far greater than we are ourselves. Sometimes we like to think that we have it all together. When people ask how we're doing, we will very often just say, fine, I'm fine. And that may be because there are issues going on in our lives that we don't feel prepared to talk about. Maybe they're still too painful for us to share. Or maybe we don't really have a relationship with the person who's asking us that would allow us to share some of our private pain and disappointments with them. So we simply say, I'm fine. Perhaps you've heard that insight or that comment that someone made about that word fine, that it's really an acronym, F-I-N-E, feelings inside, not expressed or never expressed. We keep it inside. We're fine. We don't want to talk about it. And in its own way, this is a strategy that we often take just to present ourselves as being resilient and strong. We're fine. We can handle it. But we know that there are so many things in our lives that make us feel not very fine. And David certainly experienced this when he wrote the words of Psalm 61. We don't know exactly why he wrote this prayer. Presumably he's on the run. He feels vulnerable and afraid. Many commentators think that David wrote this psalm when his own son Absalom presented a great and immediate threat to him. He wanted to be king. He wanted to kill his father. So David is on the run from his own flesh and blood, perhaps feeling like as he's at the end of the earth, he's at the end of his rope, the end of his life. But how good it is to know that the end of the rope does not mean the end of prayer. How good it is to know that when we come to the end of our resources, we can especially then pray to God with renewed intensity and with fervent hope and faith. The end of the earth is not the end of prayer. In fact, for many of us, it signals the beginning of prayer, urgent prayer, praying with humility, praying with faith and hope, asking that God will be that rock and that he will lead us to himself, that rock that is higher than we are. Sometimes as the heart gets faint, prayer gets strong. I've seen that happen in the lives of many people. I've experienced that myself. When the heart gets faint, when we are weary, prayer gets strong. And that's a very good thing, because it's then when we realize how limited and vulnerable and small we are, and we begin to see in new, fresh ways how powerful and loving and great God is. What David is really asking when he asks God to lead him to the rock that is higher than himself is this: God, bring me to yourself. God is that rock. And God, as he hears that prayer, answers it by bringing us closer to him, even if that's in situations of pain and fear and vulnerability. Perhaps especially then we can experience what it means for God to bring us closer to him. So David is asking God to bring him to himself. And you know, that image of a rock is one that is so often found in the Bible, especially in the Psalms. In fact, in the very next psalm, Psalm 62, The opening words of that psalm read as follows: "My soul finds rest in God alone. My salvation comes from him. He alone is my rock and my salvation." I'll say a little bit more about Psalm 62 in a few minutes. But it's good for us to know that God is our rock. Again, that was a fitting image and verse for us to think about on New Year's Day 2020. And as we think about that now, on New Year's Day 2020, no one could have imagined what that coming year would bring, especially with the COVID pandemic, which we are still living with today, over 2 years later. I asked the congregation this question on that New Year's Day back in 2020. Who knows what the year 2020 will bring? And of course, no one did. But we do know, in spite of all of the uncertainty, all of the fear, all of the changes in our lives, which have been most difficult and which we, to some degree, are still living with, it's good to know that God is changeless in his love. He is the security, the rock that is far greater than we are, the rock who meets us in all our brokenness, fear, and vulnerability. And this is especially true because of the relationship we have with God in Jesus Christ. When David prays, asking that the king, praying for himself, presumably, as the legitimate king of Israel, even though he's on the run, he prays that God will bless the king, protect the king, that God will give the king long life. Well, that king ultimately is David's literal descendant and the great king of all kings, the Lord Jesus. And when we have a relationship with Jesus Christ, we especially know what it means to live with a firm ground beneath our feet, the rock of Christ's faithfulness and love. It's interesting that in the New Testament, the image of rock is applied to Jesus. Peter, for instance, writes about how Jesus is that precious cornerstone. He's quoting from the book of Isaiah when he refers to Jesus this way. Jesus is the chosen precious cornerstone, but he was the rock that was rejected. We are still fresh in the memories of Lent, and Good Friday are still fresh in our memories. And that, of course, is what the rejection that Jesus faced was all about, his suffering, his dying. The rejected rock is our precious cornerstone. And to live in a relationship with Jesus Christ is to know that because he was forsaken, we will always be accepted. Because he is strong, we can have confidence in our weakness. By his death, we have life. I love the way Barbara Brown Taylor reflects on this in one of her sermons. And it's interesting that she uses the image of rock climbing in this message. She highlights two different understandings of what it means to believe in someone. Do you believe in Jesus? Many of us would say yes. I hope you can say yes to that question. But there are two different ways that we believe in Jesus, or believe in anyone for that matter. And Barbara Brown Taylor explains it this way. On one level, to believe someone means simply to accept what that person says is true, usually on the basis of some evidence. So if someone shows you a picture of himself climbing the rock face of a mountain and tells you it can be done, you say, I believe you. You accept the proposition. You give your intellectual assent based on the evidence. That's one way of believing someone. You trust what they say is true based on evidence. But as she goes on to say, there's another level of belief that's much more visceral than this. Instead of showing you a picture, someone invites you to go rock climbing with him. As he checks the knots on you and harness and runs your safety line through the carabiner around his own waist, he assures you that everything will be all right. The proper response at that point is not, I believe you, but I believe in you. Because you are way past anything like intellectual assent at this point. You're about to climb a mountain and be harnessed to someone who has far more experience than you do. You have set yourself in relationship with this person, as she puts it, and you are trusting him with your life. That's what it means to believe in Jesus, to do so not only based on evidence, with an intellectual kind of assent to doctrine, that's very important, but ultimately to believe in Jesus is exactly as Barbara Brown Taylor puts it, to trust someone with your life, to be harnessed to that person, to know that despite all of your inexperience, all of your weakness, all of your vulnerability, you are harnessed, tethered, attached by faith to someone far greater than you, who is a rock and who leads you up the rock face of a mountain to the rock that is higher than you. That's faith, and that's trust. And that's what it means for us to know, despite all of the uncertainty and difficulty of life, that as we pray to God, he hears that prayer. He brings us to the rock that he is, far higher and greater than we are, and we can trust that as we are connected to him by faith in Jesus Christ, he will never let us go. This brings me to Psalm 62. Just a verse in that, some reflections on a verse in that psalm that also reflects on what it means to know God as our rock. In Psalm 62, David, again, the writer of this psalm, says that God is my fortress, I will never be shaken. That's one translation of that verse. Not the best translation, because in that verse, the word translated in this translation that I just read to you, the word translated as never is a subtle, somewhat difficult adverb that can be translated differently. But the word never is not really a good translation, and in fact, it's not an accurate translation. Can you honestly say, as you look at your life, that you have never been shaken? That you have never been rattled or caught off guard or felt afraid? Life is not like that. We are shaken all the time. The better way to translate that adverb is not never, but greatly. So the essence of that verse is not, I will never be shaken, but I will never be greatly shaken. As one writer puts it, the adverb qualifies the intensity of being shaken, but not its possibility. We will always be shaken, but we will never be greatly shaken to the point where we are overwhelmed, where we are shaken to the point of death and just the end of ourselves. That won't happen because God in his mercy and faithfulness, being the higher rock, has come to us. And because we are tethered to him, while we are shaken, we will never be greatly shaken, in the sense that we won't be overwhelmed. This is the important part. We may be shaken, but not greatly shaken. Our safety may seem threatened, but we will not be overcome. That's the hope and promise of the gospel. In Psalm 61 and in Psalm 62. These are good words for us to think about on any given day of the year. And I hope that as you hear these reflections and these prayers of Psalm 61 and 62, that you know God as that rock. I hope you know yourself as a rock, someone who with strength, with capability, with a great future. But that's especially true and only possible, ultimately, because of that rock that is higher than we are, that God graciously brings us to, the rock that he is himself. I hope this message has given you encouragement and hope, and I hope that in spite of all of the unpredictability of life and the brokenness that we sometimes experience, we will, through it all, know the joy of knowing God, the rock who is higher than we are, the rock that God always graciously brings us to himself. Thanks so much for watching. Be well and be blessed.